Welcome back to our history of music. Now today is hopefully going to be an interesting one. It's definitely been the most challenging for me so far, especially in deciding what to include and what to leave out. Talking about prehistoric music really does present its own unique challenge. But by comparison, even in the ancient world, where in many cases we have cultures that either don't have a notation system, or what notation system they have is either very rudimentary or it's very hard for us to decipher, we nonetheless have many writings about the music itself, about the significance that certain types of music had. And we have a number of unambiguous depictions of musicians in various settings, and we have their musical instruments. Now, when it comes to prehistory, we often only have circumstantial evidence. Any of the specifics of the musical practice are utterly lost to us. The few cases of direct evidence that we do have, such as prehistoric musical instruments, are fragmentary, and there are many different ways in which people join the dots between these fragmentary finds. And the stories that we tell about them are changing all the time as new evidence and new theories emerge. So how do you tell a story when the story itself is constantly changing? Now for my part, what I've tried to do so far is to tell a sort of historiography of prehistoric music. In a sense, a history of the study of prehistoric music, focusing in particular on the last few decades and using this survey as a way of exploring many of the key ideas in the field. Now, the last two episodes have taken us through the last few decades of the 20th century and up until the first years of the 21st century. So today we will be looking at some of the ideas to emerge over the last decade or so, which really has seen an explosion of significant work in the field. Now, in terms of resources that you can quite easily get your hands on, there are two that really stick out to me. The first is Ian Morley's The Prehistory of Music, which is an encyclopedic work, which really brings together and consolidates a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about so far, as well as adding new commentaries and drawing new connections between them. And the other, by Gary Tomlinson, is called A Million Years of Music, which, as you may have guessed from the title, I'll be drawing on quite heavily in this episode. Now, some of you may have already recognized his name from previous episodes. Tomlinson is, for my money, one of the most significant living writers in the field. And by field, I don't just mean prehistoric musicology, but musicology in general. His contribution to the study of a deeper history of music and of the humanities is truly monumental, even just in terms of the sheer variety of topics. Just to give you an idea, aside from a great number of writings on all the more conventional topics in musicology that you would expect, he's also the author of what is the book on the role of music in Renaissance magic, as well as one of the foremost books on the musical cultures of Central American peoples around the time of the contact between the West and the Americas. And now he's written what almost certainly will become one of the defining texts of the study of prehistoric music. And what I've come to really admire the more I have read is his desire to draw you into the perspectives of others, into other worlds on their own terms. Now, A Million Years of Music is a very ambitious title for a book that is only 300 pages long, but Tomlinson pulls it off pretty well. And the conclusions that he reaches at once build on a number of the ideas that we have discussed so far, and at the same time subvert many of their earlier interpretations. For Tomlinson, music is no more or less than a specific instance of a broader set of changes to human behavioral patterns which led to the emergence of modern humans. Now, one thing that I do have to point out before we really get stuck in is that in order to condense this down into an episode of about an hour or so, I will be telling the story in a relatively linear fashion, but the reality of what I will be talking about is obviously much more complex and messy, and there's a great deal of tension between narratives of continuity and discontinuity in the literature. But it would take much too long for the constraints of a series like this one to go into that kind of detail. After all, the original story took 1 million years to play out, and unfortunately we don't have that kind of time. I have also had to cut out Tomlinson's discussion of biocultural epicycles, which I'm sure he would strongly object to, since that's like his baby. But I will be adding links in the description to 2 of his lectures in which he expands on many of the topics that we're talking about here, and which I sincerely suggest you check out. So, let's get stuck in. Now, Tomlinson begins his book before the emergence of language, before even anything that we might recognize as music. But there is one thing that he argues was there 1 million years ago, and that is the social transmission of information. In particular, he looks at the pervasive presence of Acheulean hand axes, or bifaces as they're sometimes called, in the archaeological record. Now, the Acheulean hand axes are the very famous symmetrical hand axes that, because of their pervasive presence in the archaeological record, are almost a symbol of Stone Age technology in the popular imagination. And you can see an example of a very fine specimen on the cover of this episode. And Tomlinson says of these hand axes, and I quote, "Think what it would be like to manufacture a sophisticated tool without planning to do so. Probably you cannot. Perhaps the thought experiment is impossible, because your brain is not the same as the brain that could. Now imagine passing your unthought tool-making skills to others around you, creating an enduring cultural tradition without awareness, even without consciousness of a human sort. And imagine further transmitting this tradition in the absence of anything resembling modern language. No semantic vocalization to speak of, no syntax, no propositional utterances of any kind. What kind of cognitive capacities could enable such a situation? What kind of social interaction?" Now, what is referred to as the Acheulean industry is a stone tool-making tradition epitomized by the hand axes that began to replace a previous, more rudimentary tradition, the old oven, around about 1.7 million years ago. And this tradition persisted largely unchanged for well over 1 million years, and only really being replaced in a significant way by more complex technologies somewhere between 300,000 and 130,000 years ago, depending on where you look in the world. Now think about that. 1.7 million years ago to 130,000 years ago. That's more than 1 million years over which we find the same kinds of technologies over and over again. This almost certainly classifies the Acheulean tradition as the most stable and long-lasting form of industry in human history. In fact, all of human history since the invention of written records, so what we normally think of as human history, would easily fit 200 or 300 times in the lifespan of the Acheulean tradition. Contrast this with the rate of technological change in our own culture, and you will have the barest glimpse of how different these ancient human minds were from our own. So the question is, how did these ancient humans preserve a cultural tradition for so long without language? How did they transmit information without referentiality, representation, semantics, symbolism, and all of those other things without which our own culture would evaporate in an instant? Now, Tomlinson makes an interesting observation on this difference. While Language is inconceivable without referentiality, without semantics. Music relies on transmitting information that is not semantically loaded. And in fact, music is not the only example of this. While we today generally tend to think of language as the main modality of information transmission, in the span of hominin history, about 7 million years or so, non-semantic transmission of culture has been the norm, while language, with its reliance on semantics, is the odd one out. And when we talk about culture, we mean the transmission of non-genetic information, learned behaviors, from one generation to the next, either through mimicry or communication, habit formation, and so on. When viewed in this way, we can see that culture is in fact widely dispersed throughout the animal kingdom, and there are those who even argue in the plant kingdom. The point, though, is that culture precedes language. In fact, it even precedes humans by a very long stretch. So, to uncover a deep history of music's origins, we need to move away from a linguocentric view of culture and find something more fundamental. Most culture is not linguistic. It's performative and gestural, and music is only one example of this. In other words, most culture is embodied in the activity itself, in the gestures and in the artifacts. A great master vase maker could write a detailed description of how to make a vase, and you could then read this description, but you would still be unable to sit down and then produce a vase that comes anywhere near the master's original, just having read that text. The true knowledge of artisans cannot be translated into words or numbers, because ultimately it resides in their hands, not just in words or ideas. So, what can we surmise about the minds that would have made these Acheulean bifaces or hand axes? Some have looked at the symmetry and the precision in the sequence of strokes as a sign that planning went into making these tools, that they are the result of a self-conscious intention or a mental template, that the toolmaker already had in their mind an idea of what they wanted to make. Others have seen the symmetries as merely resulting from a simple, repeated and embodied gestural sequence. After all, patterned movements in the animal world also result in complex, symmetrical patterns all the time. Think of the tracks left by a centipede. The pattern is both very complex and symmetrical. This is due to the symmetry of the centipede's physical structure, as well as the regularity of its movements. In fact, we could go as far as to call this regularity rhythmical. Both these positions lie somewhat at extremes. One wants to put the mind first, and the other wants to put the gesture and the stone first. But the relationship between the two is much more intimate. They are inextricably linked. One is tied to the other, and vice versa. In Tomlinson's words, it is the body-stone interaction from which symmetries and perhaps the mind emerge. The process is recursive. As each flake is chipped off, the stone acquires a slightly different shape, and the following strike is adjusted accordingly. With each stroke, the relationship between body and stone is being renegotiated. And this is as true today as it was then. The things that we make shape us as much as we shape them. Ancient humans, who weren't even aware of doing so, were creating incredibly long-lasting and stable traditions of tool-making. These traditions were not expressed in metaphysical or abstract blueprints, in ideas, but in the patterns of activity that ran through the life of the community, what is often called performative sociality. We see instances of such unplanned performative sociality in the social groups of mammals and primates. These societies are not built from the top down, starting from an abstract conception of the society itself. Rather, the structure is built from the bottom up, starting from the co-present gestures and interactions of the individuals. As we have said before, everything is negotiated in the moment. The stones, with their rippling, symmetrical patterns, are a document of the taskscape of ancient humans, of the operational sequences that were a part of their daily lives, with each flake leaving a negative imprint on the surface as it was chipped off. Now, unplanned though these actions might have been, even at its simplest, the Acheulean biface is a prosthetic externalization of cognition, and in it we catch glimpses of humanity's technological future, of all those externalizations to come, such as the system of external memory storage that we call writing. And the recursive nature of the taskscape documented in the bifaces, the mimicry and the performative sociality that is implied by the stability of the transmission of this technology, to quote from Tomlinson's work, reflect the rhythmicization of brains, bodies, and hands, inscribing the world and giving dimensions of space and time to daily life. This rhythmicization takes us right back to something we discussed in earlier episodes: entrainment, or the ability to synchronize one's actions with those of others or with the cadence of some external cycle. Now, any synchronization of activities that we might talk about when it comes to humans living 1 million years ago must be understood in the loosest sense possible. Don't go imagining that these social toolmakers would have joined their strikes into a single percussive beat or anything like that. We have no evidence to suggest anything of the sort. However, the mimetic nature of these traditions and the fidelity of the transmission indicates an ability of individuals to voluntarily shape gestures so as to mirror behaviors and patterns that they observed in the world around them. They likely learned simply through imitation, but to imitate means to shape your gestures according to a pattern that you have observed outside of yourself. In music, the term entrainment is used in a very specific sense. It designates our ability to recognize regularities in a sequence of beats and to synchronize our gestures to those beats, whether that be playing or dancing. But to understand the origins of this behavior, we need to consider the broadest possible definition of entrainment: the linking of 2 or more repeating cycles. This can be anything from the synchronization between the lunar cycles and the rising and falling of the tides, to the examples from chronobiology that we saw back in episode 1. In other words, the ways in which organisms link their biological rhythms to the cycles of their environment. For example, sleep patterns coinciding with day-night cycles, and patterns of activity varying throughout the year with the changing of the seasons. And we can extend this view into the organism itself as well. Joseph McGrath and Janice Kelly propose an understanding of the organism as a loosely coupled population of oscillators. In other words, as interlocked cascading cycles occurring at all levels: heartbeats, breathing, patterns of firing neurons, metabolic cycles, molecular cycles within the cell, as well as the life cycles and the reproductive cycles of the organism itself. This linking of cycles results in dynamic, non-linear patterns within the organism, between organisms, and between organisms and the environment. Cycles within cycles. It has been proposed, and this is still debated, but a lot of work has been done around this, that the mechanism underlying musical entrainment might be found in sets of oscillating neurons which are able to synchronize their firing to the oscillating pattern of periodical external events. Now, as you'll remember from the first episode, pitch and rhythm can in essence be understood as the same kind of physical phenomenon, even though we perceive them differently. A pitch or a tone is simply a repeating pattern, like a rhythm, but one that occurs so quickly that we're no longer able to perceive the constituent parts as we do in a rhythm, and so we perceive the whole as something new, as pitch. Now, according to this hypothesis, these oscillating neurons would be linked to one another in hierarchies, allowing us to perceive not only a pulse, but also the subdivisions of that beat. Analogously, they would allow us to perceive not just pitches, but also the relationships between the fundamental frequency and the upper harmonics, and also the relationships between pitches, things such as melodies and harmonies, which function in a very similar way to rhythms. We find harmonies consonant when the relationship between the pitches approximates simple mathematical ratios. Just as we recognize a collection of beats as being part of the same rhythm, when the interaction of their cycles can be described in relatively simple mathematical terms. But all of this would only come much later. We don't see any evidence of entrainment or of pitch recognition this precise or sophisticated in the Acheulean cultures. However, it is not so much of a stretch to imagine that they would have had maybe a much more basic form of these regularly oscillating neuronal structures, which would have provided a significant boost to something we call future-directed attending. In other words, the ability to anticipate what may be coming up next. And we see this ability clearly on display in music. The fact that musicians and dancers can play or move together in time means that they are all anticipating when the next beat will fall and they arrive on it together. They're not waiting to see if the other one hits the beat and then reacting accordingly. They all know when the next beat is going to come along. This future-directed attending does not just apply to music, naturally. In fact, it applies to pretty much everything we do. And some scholars have in fact suggested that musical entrainment can be understood as a very specific and highly sophisticated instance of the more general mechanism of future-directed attending and the way in which we perceive the structure of events in time. The growing development of this capacity for anticipation foreshadows something known as thinking at a distance, an ability that is fundamental to all us modern humans, and it's the ability to project the mind in space and time somewhere where the body is not. Now, sometime around 500,000 years ago, among the remains of Homo heidelbergensis, we begin to see new forms of sociality appearing. Now, these should not be understood as something altogether new, but more as an intensification of the social complexity of those co-present interactions from 1 million or so years earlier found among Homo erectus and Ergaster. Sites such as the famous remains found at Boxgrove in southern England paint a picture of the early stirrings of cooperative sociality, of theory of mind, what is sometimes called social mind reading, or the ability to understand other people's intentions and attentions, and also of the presence of cognitive abilities that would one day coalesce into language. These sites document the activities of scavenging humans of an order of complexity not observed in early Acheulean remains. We can imagine a group of hominins 500,000 years ago finding the carcass of a freshly dead animal. What would have likely followed would be one of the most striking examples of how far a sophisticated, co-present sociality can take you with just a hint of thinking at a distance. To quote from Tomlinson's own description, "The few well-studied sites reflect concentrated matrices of collaboration that depended on joint attention and, if we had to guess, emotional interactions of considerable power if short range. Nearby stones had to be collected in order to be fashioned quickly into bifaces or flakes. Larger stones or large bones might be pressed into service as anvils or chopping blocks. The butchering itself had to be accomplished, no easy task, especially in the case of big carcasses." The flurry of activity prompted by such an opportunity would have been brief but intense, quickened by the threat of other, bigger animals who might soon arrive, attracted by the smell of blood. In the remains at Boxgrove and other similar sites, we see evidence of all stages of this process. The gathering and preparing of stones, the skilled carving of the animal, and the scattered remains of what tools would likely have been too much of a burden to carry. It is hard to imagine such an efficient operation being carried out without some sort of rudimentary division of labour through the mediation of expressive, proto-linguistic gesture calls of some sort, although these would likely have been very far from what we understand as language today. This communication would have been fundamentally deictic. This means that the utterances and the gestures would not have carried any intrinsic meaning. A bit like when we say words like this or that or today. These words only have meaning if there is someone there who shares the context of what you are saying. Otherwise, they have no idea what the this is. Gestures, too, would have played an important part of this communication, a bit like how pointing tells you what the specific this is. But again, maybe we should be thinking of gestures even more simple and instinctive than that, like reaching out towards something or touching something. Now, this might all be reminding you of what we said in the last episode about the music-language hypothesis, about verbal and gestural common ancestors to language and music. And a lot of what we said there does apply here. However, especially since in the last episode we used Stephen Brown's idea of music language as a springboard to talk more generally about the ideas of a common descent of music and language, it's worth pointing out that in the accepted terminology, music language refers to Stephen Brown's theory specifically, and the field more generally refers to the gesture calls that preceded music and language as proto-discourse, and I will be doing the same here. It is on the whole a better term than music language, albeit less catchy, since its scope is a lot more general and less biased towards the oral aspect of communication. Now, getting back to our timeline, as we keep moving past the 500,000 year mark, we slowly begin to see shifts in the Acheulean tradition. Sporadic and gradual at first, these changes introduce new operational sequences and technologies in tool-making cultures. New feedback loops of human-environment interaction and human-material interaction are formed. By somewhere around 250,000 years ago, these new loops had truly come to dominate human taskscapes, as is documented by the remains of Neanderthals and pre-sapient humans in Africa. We see in these the evidence of an intensification of thinking at a distance, and the beginnings of a hierarchization of the modalities of thought and of communicative exchange. In other words, thinking in terms of nested structures. Evidence of stones and materials being transported long distances and possibly even exchanged before being used shows the ability of these humans to project their mind further into the future than ever before. These remains document the widening of the gap between thought and action, between the world of the mind and the moment-to-moment world of co-presence. The tools found at Boxgrove were situational, fashioned in response to a specific need or opportunity that might arise, and often discarded once the task they had been made for had been accomplished. Neanderthals, on the other hand, seem to have carried their tools with them, and in a sense curated their collections, implying that they were thinking ahead, hedging their bets against threats or opportunities that might arise in the future. The stone tools themselves, starting from about 400,000 years ago, also document a gradual shift in cognitive abilities. The bifaces of the Acheulean were produced by way of a process we call additive. This means that the finished object was the result of the same action repeated over and over again. You would gradually chip away at the stone until you got the shape you wanted. On the other hand, the tools of the New Mousterian tradition were the result of a two-step process. First, a larger stone core would be prepared, and later smaller flakes would be harvested from this core and refined into a variety of more precise and sharper tools than the preceding Acheulean tradition. These larger stone cores that were prepared ahead of time were basically like stone tool-making kits. They would be worked and shaped in such a way that a number of different flakes could easily be chipped off when required and refined into a tool appropriate for the task. To see in the prepared core the possible flake shapes that could be harvested likely required individuals who could not only, in a sense, think ahead, in terms of ordered events in time, but also humans capable of surprising feats of imagination. This stepwise thinking, in which a task is understood as a temporal hierarchy of actions that must be performed in a certain order, would find expression much later in the flowering of composite tools, in which the number of required steps would be much, much larger. Even for the simplest of composite spears, a stone would be fashioned into a point, a handle would be made out of bone or wood. A little pot would have to be made in which to gather and heat the adhesive necessary to affix the point to the handle. And, in addition to the adhesive, ropes, laboriously produced ahead of time, might also be used to bind it all together. By this time, the gap between materials and finished artifact was so great that we can only understand its bridging in terms of the emergence of temporal hierarchization, which is one of the most fundamental aspects of musical cognition, thinking in terms of structured hierarchies of events in time. This is pretty obvious when it comes to rhythm. We don't perceive all of the sounds that make up a rhythm as equally fundamental. There is a hierarchy, some of the sounds we hear as falling on the beat and some as off the beat. So for example, accenting an offbeat sound, in other words, making louder a sound that we perceive as less fundamental, is precisely the kind of rhythmical device a good drummer might use to surprise our cognitive expectations and thus draw us into the music. The ability to perceive a hierarchy of regularly spaced events in time is just as fundamental and even more precise a component of our ability to perceive pitch. As most of you will likely already know, an individual pitch is not made up of a single frequency, but rather by a large number of frequencies related by small integer ratios. So the brain, possibly through the mechanism of oscillating neurons discussed earlier, is able to relate these partials to one another in terms of their internal relations and hierarchies and group them together as a single note. In this process, the lowest harmonic is perceived as being more salient or fundamental than the others, and we hear that frequency as the pitch of the whole note, with the other partials instead creating the timbre or the colour of the note. So when you hear a collection of musicians playing together, your nervous system is confronted with an incredibly large set of frequencies all at the same time, and it then proceeds to unpack them and recombine them together so that you perceive some of those frequencies as belonging to the sound of an oboe, and others to the sound of the violin, and others again to a human voice. The process by which this happens is still deeply mysterious to us, but we do know that the mind is very good at doing this kind of thing, at ordering frequencies into these hierarchies, by way of experiments which demonstrate that if a set of harmonic partials are played that would imply a certain fundamental tone, a certain fundamental frequency, then listeners will perceive the resulting tone as having the pitch of that implied fundamental, even if the fundamental is missing out of that array of frequencies. And this is sometimes called the missing fundamental phenomenon, for obvious reasons. Now, in the remains left behind by Neanderthals, we see evidence for the ability to perceive regularities and to create regularities in bones found among their remains, which are marked with regular notches. Now, the regularity of these markings are definitely proof of a cognitive ability for spatial regularities, otherwise they couldn't have made them. But some have even suggested that these notches might be documenting the temporal experience of regularly recurring events in time of some sort or other. We are now standing on the edge of human modernity. Sometime around 100,000 years ago, among our African sapient ancestors, we observe the gradual coalescence of new cognitive abilities that build on the behavioral increments we have described so far. What emerges out of this coalescence is something that is common to all modern humans, but for which so far we have no strong evidence in other human species, and this is symbolic cognition. Some of the earliest examples of this behavior that have been uncovered are almost certainly perforated shells, which would most likely have been strung to form beads or pendants reaching as far back as 100,000 years ago. Even more tantalizing, much larger shells are found discarded, still containing the dried remnants of ochre pigment, crushed and mixed, ready for painting. The story told by these ancient paint pots is retold by a number of pieces of ochre with geometric designs scratched into the surface dating back 70,000 years at least, some almost certainly earlier, and by fragments of ostrich shells, intricately engraved, dating back to some 60,000 years ago. Perforated beads, such as shells or the teeth of carnivorous animals, would have involved great skill or difficulty or danger to acquire, and this was likely their significance. These earliest forms of symbolism were probably not yet fully symbols. They were not so much representations of something, rather they stood as a token of the labour or the cost or the risk associated with acquiring them. In this way, they functioned like a simpler form of sign than the symbol, what is often called an index. An index is, in essence, something that points to another thing not by representation, but through simple association, often causal association. The example that is usually given is smoke and fire, smoke being the index of fire, Or you could think of a fast-moving shadow on the ground indicating a predator in the sky, or maybe a distant growl or a footprint indicating the presence of a lion too close for comfort. For Tomlinson, this is also the kind of function that early proto-discursive gesture calls, those ancestors of music and language, would have had. They were not yet referential semantic symbols, but simply indexical and deictic. Similarly, the earliest use of paints and other pigments was probably not involved in the creation of wholly independent symbols, but more for altering or enhancing already existing signs. Painting the face could exaggerate its expressive power, making a growl or a grimace more terrifying, or otherwise conferring power to the painted individual. Tracing over the already existing lines of the face with paint or charcoal makes them louder. Now, understanding this opens up a deep history of symbols that stretches far, far back, in which symbolism starts as something very close to repetition, the retracing of existing patterns. Even the earliest musical instruments, and it's not even really right to call them such, we should maybe use terms like sound producers or acoustic tools, should probably be thought of in a similar light. Before flutes, there would have almost certainly been all manner of vocal resonators. Conical pieces of wood or bone, either shaped by chance or human hands, so that when placed on the mouth, the voice would be amplified by them. And how far back before this humans were using their hands around their mouths to direct and amplify their voices when calling, just as we do today, would be impossible to guess. All these liminal cases raise the question of whether we are even able to always recognize early musical instruments or sound producers when we find them. After all, many people would likely not recognize a bull roarer as an instrument if they saw one lying on the floor. It's just a piece of wood tied to a rope. Little would they guess the instrument's deep history, spanning tens of thousands of years across all inhabited continents. Nor would they imagine the deep associations it has with the summoning of spirits and other higher mysteries, or what a profound and strange sound such an instrument can produce. So starting from something that was very close to repetition, and through a gradual lengthening of the taskscape and a widening of the distance between thought and action, gradually came displaced referentiality, symbols proper, both as a way of bridging this ever-widening gap, but also as the greatest widening of this gap that had occurred up until that point. Symbols are one step further removed than indexes. Once a system of symbol is established, it functions almost independently. They all point to one another in the way that indexes point to the things that they are associated with. If you wanted to know the meaning of the word cat, you might look it up in a dictionary, where you would find that the word is defined in terms of other associated words. Now, if you also didn't know these words, then you would have to look up those, and so on. The only way you would ever get out of this predicament is by some form of deixis, or index, someone pointing to a cat and saying, "This is a cat." The advent of symbolism brings us to another important aspect of cognition that comes to prominence in this time: systematicity. For example, when we say that symbols all point to each other, or how words can be combined together to create an infinite combination of sentences. And this is not too different from the way in which the different steps of making a composite tool can be switched out and plugged into the operational chain that goes into making another tool. The process of making a handle or preparing adhesive, for example, is found in the making of many different implements, just as words can be swapped in and out of a sequence to create different variations of meaning. For example, I wouldn't eat that if I were you, and I wouldn't touch that if I were you. This kind of cognition is often called combinatorial thinking, and there are a number of theories proposing that this syntax of tool making was a cognitive precursor to linguistic syntactical thinking, a precursor of syntax both in language and music, in fact. And it's a very useful way of tracing the evolution of these behaviours when we cannot hope to have any direct evidence of things such as speech and music. Now, anthropologist Terence Deacon suggests that with any system of symbols, there necessarily arises alongside it some form of syntax, some kind of grammar-like rules, even if these may be very rudimentary, and these rules describe how the symbols can be linked together. Tomlinson's insight is that this can even happen at the indexical level. And so even musical pitches, which are not symbols, they're barely signs of any kind, really. When combined together, they can give rise to larger indexical units through the patterns or the rules of tonality. What Tomlinson describes as a high-level upstructuring with no symbolic outcome. Now, this combinatorial, systematized form of information processing would also have risen alongside a discretization of thought, what Tomlinson calls a digitization of thought. In other words, if you are able to think in a combinatorial fashion to swap in and out the different components of a process, then you need to be thinking of these different parts as distinct things, as quantized units. This is the dividing up of the continuous, fluid world of perception into discrete conceptual chunks. Now, with this idea of combinatorial discreteness, Tomlinson revisits the idea of the ancestral split between music and language out of those proto-discursive gesture calls. This split would likely have already been well underway around the time that we see the first clear evidence of symbolic thinking and representation in the archaeological record. In language, this combinatorial discreteness would have manifested at the level of the phonemes. This is the breaking up of the gesture calls into discrete little sound chunks. Think back at what we said in the last episode about how a baby learns to talk, starting from an indistinct continuum of vocalization and gradually paring this continuum down to a set of distinct, discrete, repeatable, and recognizable sounds. This combinatoriality of language also manifested at the level of words and the ways that they can be recombined to form sentences. On the musical side of this split, instead, combinatoriality would be built not on the phonetic discreteness of language, but on discrete pitches. The division of the frequency spectrum into discrete pitches, into separate notes, is probably one of the closest things we have to a universal in music. Since, though not every single instance of music uses discrete pitches, virtually all musical cultures around the world employ the use of discrete pitches in some form or another, and in the majority of cases it is absolutely fundamental. Now, out of the combinatoriality of these discrete pitches emerges tonality, which has form, but again does not represent anything. And when I say tonality, I don't necessarily mean here specifically Western tonality. That's just one example, I mean all forms of tonality. Because barring what are, in the grander scope of music, very recent and very non-typical examples, tonality is found in almost every musical tradition. And in its most general sense, it can be understood as a sort of centre of gravity towards which the notes want to tend. This centre of gravity can be static, or it can shift over the course of a piece. Sometimes there can be more than one competing gravitational centre, but the ubiquity of the gestures of tension and release in musics the world round that rely on pitches moving to and from these gravitational centres suggests that this is not simply arbitrary. And the fact that we can recognise the relationships between notes even when they're shifted up and down the frequency spectrum, in the same way that you can recognise a melody even when it's transposed to a different key, makes this case even more strongly. In reference to the oscillating neuron theory that we discussed earlier, many have suggested that a tonal encoding of this kind goes hand in hand with the perception of discrete pitch. When we encounter pitches that are related by a 2-to-1 ratio, the two pitches appear to us to be incredibly similar. The perception of this striking similarity is likely something that we share with humans across the globe and probably dates back a few tens of thousands of years at least. The 2-to-1 ratio is, of course, the octave, where one frequency oscillates at twice the speed of the other, and we perceive pitches an octave apart as being so similar that they appear to be almost exactly the same thing, just occurring at different scales. We also have smaller intervals than the octave that similarly cluster around small integer ratios, 3-2, what we call the perfect fifth, 4-3, we call that the fourth, 5-4, and so on. These are also found across many cultures. Our recognition of their similarity is weaker than that of the octave, but it likely exploits the same neuronal system. These smaller intervals subdivide the octave unequally, and it is from this asymmetry that many musics draw their power. Traditionally, the musical scales constructed by many cultures across the world tend to comprise somewhere between 4 and 7 tones, whose pitch ratios cluster somewhere around these simple mathematical ratios. As a result, many traditional scales are asymmetrical in structure. For Westerners, the standard major and minor scales are perfect examples of this. And it is likely this asymmetry, this imbalance, which engenders a sense of there being a tonal hierarchy and a tonal centre towards which the notes want to tend. It is certainly the case that scales, on the other hand, with a symmetrical structure, or scales with very few asymmetries, such as some Gamelan scales, the pentatonic scales, the so-called diminished scale, or the hexatonic scale, these tend to have a less defined sense of a tonal centre and tonal hierarchies, and perfectly symmetrical scales just seem to go on and on when you play them. You don't come to a point of rest or a note that seems to be more salient than the others. Now, with this final coalescing of combinatorial, discrete syllables and discrete pitches, we can truly finally talk about talking and musicking in a way that is analogous to modern musicking and talking. We are now dealing with fully modern humans. Humans who weren't only anatomically modern, those had been around for 150,000 years already, but humans who were culturally modern. In other words, humans whose behaviours to a large extent differ from ours in the same order that the behaviours of other humans living in other cultures around the world today differ from us. especially when we consider the case of contemporary humans living in pre-settled societies. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's a good way of understanding how truly close these humans would have been to us. This coalescence into modernity would likely have taken place around the time of the final migrations out of Africa, some 60 to 50,000 years ago, and may even have been brought from Africa by these latest migratory waves. It is shortly after this that we begin to find an explosion of very unequivocally human activities. The earliest representational figures, the famous Lion Man sculpture, or the earliest unambiguous musical instruments, dating from around 40,000 years ago. In both cases, the design is sufficiently advanced that we cannot imagine that these were the first of their kind. Many of these finds have been unearthed in caves, and along with the famous examples of rock art and cave painting, they have created an image in the mind of the general public that prehistoric humans lived in caves. But they almost certainly did not live in caves, if by live in we mean the same kind of thing that we mean when we say that we live in a permanent dwelling like a house. Prehistoric humans were nomadic. They were a shifting, moving, migrating part of the natural landscape. The caves would likely have functioned as something closer to temporary campsites, or some other form of temporary shelter, possibly used on a seasonal basis. We know from remains that our ancestors returned to these caves over and over, in some cases over the course of thousands of years. Now, sometimes we may be dealing with different groups of humans stumbling upon the same cave, which was exploited by more than one group in a similar fashion at different times. But in other cases, we're likely dealing with the same group returning to a cave again and again, its location being handed down from one generation to the next. After all, for these ancient nomadic humans, knowledge of the land was everything. In the context of these very active and mobile lives, caves would have likely functioned as focal points, landmarks both in space and in time. The caves provided shelter for these humans, but also something more intangible, and in a sense, more profound. In Tomlinson's own words, their shelters sharpened their lifeways. The group identity crystallized in the light and heat of the fires they lit in the entryways. With this came many things, good and not. Reenactments and recountings of the day's activities. The laying of plans for subsequent days. Assertions of leadership, resulting in rivalries and fights. The furthering or fracturing of new and old liaisons, ranging from strategic alliance to sexual bonding, and often including both. Now, in these activities, and in the crystallizing of the identity of the group, the taskscapes of humans specialized. New modalities of creation flourished, artifacts whose purpose was not merely functional, but decorative or symbolic or transcendental. The more skilled makers would have worked the most precious materials, and out of these they would have fashioned items that were not simply valued for the difficulty involved in obtaining the material, or just for the skill required in making the object. They would have also held some communally understood significance. Worn around the neck, or on clothing, or fixed to a spear, they might have granted the wearer a certain status, or indicated group membership. Other artifacts would have held even deeper and stranger meanings, perhaps summoning or embodying unseen powers. Even the making of such talismans would have been in itself an act of deep magic. Even by calling it magic here, I feel that I'm guilty of projecting a modern concept onto a world where no such idea likely existed. Or at least, it seems to me that the concept of magic need only really have arisen once humans had separated themselves from the rest of nature. When, on the other hand, they were living in a world in which they already knew that everything was alive, that everything was moved by a spirit, then when they were talking about these things, they weren't really talking about magic, but simply about life. Now, some of these talismans would have been taken deep into the caves, where we have evidence of even stranger activities. We might talk here about interior journeys, about religion, or about exploring consciousness or reality, or we might even discuss the evidence for the use of psychedelics in some of these practices. But again, as with magic, we would be falling here into some serious retrojection. So for now, it will be enough to say that these were humans that were becoming increasingly aware of a very deep and fundamental mystery, one that has preoccupied human culture ever since: the profoundly strange and mysterious nature of existence itself. In these specialized taskscapes, we find a very strange new type of tools: hollow bird bones, or a mammoth tusk split open, scraped out and reattached with adhesive, with finger holes scraped or drilled at specific intervals. These tools were not used in the gathering or preparing of food, nor were they used for hunting or to make clothing. But for those who knew how to blow into them, they could produce a dazzling array of sounds, drawing to them and controlling unseen acoustical forces. Some of these doubtless would have also been carried deep into the caves to conjure up or entreat with the mysteries that lay within. In one of the caves, the flutes found bare, enigmatic notches cut all along the length of the pipe. These markings don't seem to have been used during the construction to help locate the correct placement of the finger holes, since reconstructions show that they were cut after the holes were made. They also don't seem to really have a decorative function, as they are spaced irregularly and become more bunched up as they approach the end of the pipe, suggesting the engravers didn't know how many marks they would be making when they started out. This has led some scholars to suggest that perhaps each notch recorded a use of the instrument, possibly in a recurring practice of great significance, and each time the flute was used, another notch would be added as a primitive form of external memory storage. The flutes would likely have been carried with them as the group travelled, the oldest perhaps holding the record of many generations' use. The making of pipes with discrete finger holes is evidence that thinking of pitch in terms of discrete steps was already well established. But it also likely reinforced this cognitive process by embodying a fixed set of pitches in a physical artifact external to the mind. We have talked many times today about the emerging ability for thinking at a distance in early humans, but there is also another word that we use for this today, and that is abstraction. And Tomlinson sees in the final coalescence of discrete pitch also the distancing of pitch itself from the signification, the indexical meaning that proto-discursive gesture calls held. Now, the patterns of pitches in musicking would still display many of the aspects of cognition used in other, more concrete areas of the taskscape. In language or in tool making, all those hierarchical, combinatorial, iterative, indexical aspects that we have been talking about throughout. But these formal aspects of cognition, in a sense we might say the very patterns of human thought themselves, would be taken by musicking into a new territory, a place of form and pattern that is released from signification, into the territory of the abstract. Seen in this way, the release of pitch into abstraction represents one of the furthest developments of thinking at a distance. The order of abstraction involved seems in many ways similar to what happened much later in mathematics or geometry or logic, which were also from the first, and still are today, at least for the more advanced practitioners, in some sense profoundly mystical disciplines. But the nature of musicking was and remained profoundly embodied, while the embodiedness of things like mathematics or logic, which were necessarily in origin also embodied activities, even though we think of them as purely abstract now, their embodiedness gradually became less evident over time. And we will return to this when talking about the cultural association of music and mathematics. The pipes were also, in a sense, measuring devices. Not in the sense of measuring devices used to aid in the construction of something, the way that you might use a ruler, but in the deeper sense of probing into the nature of the world. Closer to the way in which we use telescopes or spectrometers today to measure the light emitted by a star. Not because we are going to use that measurement to build something, but because we hope to glean from it some understanding of the world of which we are part. When you blow into pipes, you find that pipes of different length produce different pitches. The cutting of pipes into different lengths in order to find and obtain new pitches is inherently an act of inquiry into the world, into the measurement and nature of acoustical phenomena. And what is more striking is that what they measured could not be seen or touched. The cutting of pipes and the boring of finger holes represents the organizing of sounds into an invisible structure, a physical object that records the forms of the immaterial world. Now, these may be the earliest examples that we have so far found of that probing into the invisible structures that we imagine to underlie the phenomena that we observe in the world, what in ancient Greek was called physis and we now call physics. Now, when in later episodes we will come to ancient China and to the ancient Greeks, we will see how in their conception of the world, music was profoundly connected to measurement, to cosmology, to the study of the universe, to mathematics, philosophy, the understanding of the invisible laws that governed reality. And we find similar instances in other cultures as well. Now, in the light of what we're discussing here, this understanding of music as a form of cosmology, of measurement of the world, should maybe be seen as a much more natural way for humans to conceive of music than we normally do. Tomlinson at one point even suggests that the union between cosmology and music is aboriginal, that it was there right from the start. The same hierarchical thinking that means that we conceive of cosmology in a hierarchical fashion, reasoning by levels of abstraction, when we say, for example, that the laws of physics are fundamental, is the same kind of thinking in nested hierarchies that was required for the emergence of musicking. Now, in this coalescing of modernity that we've been describing so far, Tomlinson identifies the emergence of something known as transcendental sociality. And the point that he is driving at throughout is that musicking is not fundamentally distinguishable from this. As he puts it in his own words, musicking coalesced from a range of cognitive and perceptual capacities alongside a coalescing of social complexity. The two formed together and were fundamentally tied to the emergence of abstract, formalized thought. And what is this transcendental sociality? In a sense, we might say that it's just the opposite of co-present sociality. Tomlinson borrows from Maurice Bloch's idea of human sociality having a double structuring. One is the bottom-up structuring of co-present sociality that we described for ancient hominins and for our primate cousins. As he puts it, a process of continual manipulations, assertions, and defeats. Everything is negotiated in the moment. The second structuring, a top-down structuring that manipulates behaviors and the course of social interactions, Bloch argues emerges from our capacity to imagine other worlds, to imagine and organize invisible hierarchies and structures that do not exist in the physical world. The idea of a chieftain or a king, for example, or of belonging to a certain caste or group or nationality. Notions of roles and structured hierarchies confer to individuals identities that are not physically present within them. Invisible halos, as Bloch calls them, which determine to quite a large extent how other people interact with them. Invisible halos may be, but often betokened by something more visible, a bead or a pendant indicating group membership or status. This form of sociality is transcendental because it is founded on the participation by individuals in an imaginary, invisible world that transcends any one of them. If a king dies, the kingship does not. A new king is found. If a professor retires or loses tenure, a new one takes up the position. No one imagines that if you could dissect the body of a Spaniard, you would find Spanish nationality, but we all know what we mean by the notion of nationality, of nation, of national border, because it's a fiction that to a greater or lesser extent we all take part in. The idea is that the growing complexity of social groups and social interactions went hand in hand with this sort of abstraction, thinking in terms of simplified formats that reduce large numbers of people to a small number of types, as Bloch puts it. These imaginary hierarchies, these invisible halos, formalize the co-present interactions of individuals. Think about that. They formalize the co-present interactions of individuals. This is very close to being an operational definition of our word ritual. A ritual is a form of performative sociality in which the actions of the participants do not arise out of their moment-to-moment intentions and attentions, but rather they follow patterns that are defined by the role that each participant takes on within an intangible, imaginary structure which is present in the minds of those who take part. Now, if the systematicity, the combinatoriality, the nested hierarchical structures, not to mention the performative and gestural aspects of this transcendental sociality, all seems quite familiar by now, that is precisely Tomlinson's point. Musicking for him is no more nor less than an instance of transcendental sociality itself. In fact, any definition of ritual that is broad enough to contain all the kinds of things that we would normally consider to be rituals would also include almost all of what we consider to be music. If, on the other hand, we wish to exclude music from the definition, we would also have to exclude many of the things that we all recognize as being rituals. Like a ritual, musicking is also a form of performative sociality in which the participants' gestures are, to some extent, predetermined by patterns which are not visible in the physical world, especially for cultures where there isn't any way of writing down or recording music, patterns which are held in the collective memory of the performers, which sometimes can mean an entire social group in the case of societies where musicking is truly a communal activity and everyone takes part. In many of these cases, the songs and the dances transcend the lives of the individuals themselves and are passed down through communal performance from one generation to the next. And even something such as improvisation, which might seem like the exact opposite of a ritual, is nonetheless highly ritualized. Often within a performance, there are designated moments in which it is understood, and in fact even expected, that one or more of the performers will take turns in spontaneously creating something new in the moment. In fact, in such moments, with everyone waiting and expecting, it would be a faux pas not to do so, to just repeat the line that everyone already knows. The success of such bursts of creativity often rests on the performer's ability to take a piece as far out as possible and then to bring it back to itself by the end of the improvisation, so that out of this flourishing of difference once again comes unity. And this ritualization does not only hold true for the performers. In cultures where there is a distinction between audience and performer, the concert-going experience is in itself a form of ritual. The audience and the performers both have certain roles that they play. The audience remains in silence while the music is being played, and then signals its approval when the performers stop by the agreed-upon convention of clapping. Now, as someone who, as a student, attended many classical and also many quote-unquote experimental concerts, I can say that people often follow these conventions even when they don't reflect their experience of the moment. I have seen people sit in bewildered silence, bored out of their minds, and then clap at the end of the performance, because that is what you do, right? Better to sit there in silence telling yourself that it will all be over soon than to be seen breaking the ritual. With other kinds of modern music events like rock concerts and raves and clubbing, which I also frequented regularly, as you do, things get a little messier, but not for this reason any less ritualistic. These are perhaps better understood as orgiastic or ecstatic rituals of some sort or another. In other words, moments of ritualized excess, towards which the stricter elements of society have always had a somewhat apprehensive attitude, both today and in the ancient world. Now, in a modern context which does not ascribe to these ecstatic gatherings a spiritual dimension, these events do often lack an underpinning and express themselves as a naked desire for excess. But much of the elevating, mystical thinking is still present under different forms. People often find a sense of communion with strangers in these events, and within these spaces, unusual behaviours are not just tolerated, but often encouraged. Even though nobody might express it in these terms, it is implicitly understood that the participants are, in a sense, possessed by the music and by whatever substances they may have taken over the course of the night. And the taking of drugs and other intoxicating substances that often accompanies these events is not merely incidental. It is there in the mystical, ecstatic, and orgiastic rituals of countless cultures. It is an impulse that reaches very, very far back into human history, and in fact into prehistory. Although there's something to be said for other cultures generally not being nearly as reckless or flippant in their approach to drugs as is often the case here. Now, similarly, it is not mere chance that we find that music is, in virtually all cultures, deeply tied to religion and to the institutions that are associated with it, and to the rituals that govern the functioning of society, and to celebration, to cosmology, to philosophy, and the measurement and the understanding of the world. Musicking is, in a sense, an expression of the same kinds of patterns of thought and interaction, transcendental patterns. And for Tomlinson, the ubiquity of this connection across cultures suggests that it is a kind of default of human behaviour, as he puts it. Now, today we've covered quite a lot of ground. So, while we let all of that sink in, as a final reflection, I would like to briefly consider how Tomlinson's writing ties in with some of the other ideas on the origin of music that we have explored in episodes so far. Now, Tomlinson's approach is definitely more holistic and one of gradual increments, and it feels more satisfying than many of the other approaches, which often tended more to focus specifically on one aspect of musicking or another, rather than the whole picture. But Tomlinson's book does not so much stand in full opposition to these other theories. In fact, he agrees that many of the behaviours described in them would have taken place, but within his framework, they're more the result of this gradual development that we have traced, rather than the origin. Music almost certainly would have promoted social cohesion among prehistoric humans, just as it does today. It would have been used in displays between groups, possibly in the defence of territories, and in fact we see this behaviour among some contemporary peoples living today. And we should also not forget our own national anthems and national military parades. And singing would likely have been used to comfort infants, or in courtship, and in myriad other ways. But for Tomlinson, all this would only fully bloom once musicking quickened into a pervasive aspect of human sociality, during this final coalescing into musicking, into transcendental sociality, and the falling of humans into modernity. So, thanks for sticking with me through all that. As usual, links to resources in the description below, and links to download the audio version of this episode. And I'll see you next time.